So this evening, we have the pleasure of having Christian and Darcy joining us because we're here to talk about mastering the transition to commercial investments and land development. And the inspiration behind this webinar was that so many people are looking now, BRRRRs and single family homes, and what's the next step? Where do we go from there when we want to craft a experienced investor portfolio? So for most of us, we start looking at, multi-unit, commercial, industrial, that kind of stuff. And then I think a lot of people, and that's why we're so glad you're able to join us too, Darcy, we sort of look at land development as like the pinnacle for real estate investing. It's like, you've made it when you've done a land development. So we couldn't talk about, scaling our portfolio without talking about land development as well. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. And I am going to introduce everybody in just a moment here. Thank you so much to all of our attendees for joining as well. We obviously would just be talking to ourselves, the three of us, if you weren't able to join us this evening. So really glad you took time out of your summer to hop on your computer or your iPad. Maybe you're sitting outside and enjoying it, and that's okay too. We're happy to have you. So just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items so that we're all on the same page. In the bottom of the chat box, I like to use the chat box during our webinar. This is where you can converse back and forth. This is where when somebody says something, you can comment or add your 2 cents or whatever you want to do. So to chat with everybody in the webinar, please go to the chat box. Make sure you have all panelists and attendees clicked, because otherwise, if it's all panelists, it's only Christian, Darcy, and I who see your message. And of course, if you want to share with everyone, all panelists and attendees is the way to go. And one of the things I love about webinars is there's also a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, as you can see here. And what that does is it allows you to put questions up for the panelists to cover, and it means that it doesn't get lost in the shuffle of the chat box. So any questions that will be for the panelists to cover after we've sort of gone through our pre-prepared questions, then please put it in the Q&A box, and we will do our absolute best to work our way through everybody's questions before we end for the evening. So that should be fairly easy. Oh, yeah, and my name's Elizabeth Kelly. Thank you for joining us. I've been a real estate investor for the last 15 years. My specialties are apartment buildings, rent-to-owns, and then I've done, like all 3 of the panelists here this evening, we've all done, multiple strategies before we finally settled into the strategy that we enjoy the most, that we like the most, and that best suits our skill set. I find typically is where we end up. I was, for 8 years, I was an elite trainer for Rich Dad Canada. I'm also a coach and a mentor, and I have a property management company as well here in Ontario. Joining us this evening is also Christian. Christian has a beautiful bio here, but Christian and I, we go way back. So Christian, I'm not even going to read any of that. I'm just going to say Christian is one of those awesome guys in real estate who it's been my pleasure to follow along and to watch as Christian has grown a fantastic portfolio, done super well for himself with his wife Chownie. They are in Ottawa, Ontario, and Christian, you're an absolute wealth of information, and I'm so glad you're able to join us this evening, because I know I will learn a ton from you, just like everyone else.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. That's very nice.
My pleasure. And then I had the good fortune this year of meeting Darcy. And Darcy is also super skilled in real estate, been an investor longer than Christian and I, and absolute ton of experience, really interesting, unique perspective. And one of the things I love is that Darcy is representing Alberta. So for those of you who are wondering, is there life outside Ontario as an investor? Absolutely there is. And it seems to be in Alberta these days, because that's where a lot of the big people are heading. So I'm really, really glad to have Darcy here with us. He's of course going to talk about some of his experience, some of his strategies, and Darcy is our land development expert working away on creating amazing things out of literally bare dirt. So we have questions that are pre-prepared that I thought would be a good opportunity to cover some of sort of the basic questions that people would be looking for information on. And then of course, put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to do our best to get to those as well. So we're going to start with talking about commercial investments. So we're going to talk first about the biggest differences between commercial deals and smaller residential deals. Christian has a particular love for light industrial. He's the only person I've ever heard talk about light industrial. So I thought, you know, there might be other people out there who love light industrial as much as Christian. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that is and why it's so appealing. We're going to talk about our preferred way to finance commercial properties, and we're going to talk about large properties. And if you've been paying attention at all or looking around at large multi-units, so much of what we're buying these days does not cash flow on day one. So the question is, how do we plan for them? How do we take a property where we're cash flow neutral or cash flow negative? What kind of a plan do we come up with? What's a reasonable timeline to transition that into something that is actually making money for us? And then from there, we're going to move over to land development. We're going to talk about what types of options are available if someone is just starting out in land development, typical costs that Darcy would see. Who do we need on our power team? When we're buying single family homes, we don't necessarily need architects and engineers and all those kinds of things. So who do we need when we're leveling up to land development? And the last question is, when analyzing a piece of vacant land, what are the first things that we need to look for to figure out if there's potential for this particular property? So we will come back, obviously, to the slides at the end. I'm going to stop my screen share there. Will this recording be shared later? Absolutely. All of my webinars are recorded, and it will be sent out within the next few days. My trusty virtual assistant, who always has my back, Mary Beth, you'll see an email come out in the next couple of days with the recording attached to it. So if you need to pop off, or if the kids need to go to bed, that's not a problem at all. We're just grateful you guys were able to join us. So why don't we start with the first question, Christian, to talk about commercial investment. So would you be able to highlight for us biggest difference between commercial deals and smaller residential purchases? What should people be expecting to see when they're transitioning from, say 1 to 4 units up to, the 5 to 10, 5 to 15, 100 unit buildings? What can they expect to see?
Sure. There's probably a few really big differences, I guess. One is that becomes immediately apparent is that with smaller properties, financing typically is very much based on your own income, right? So you have to be able to qualify for most types of lenders, with possibly the exception of private lenders. When you're dealing with commercial properties, and that could be residential with 5+ units or more, or it could be something like a office building, retail, or light industrial building, commercial properties are usually evaluated based on their income. So usually it's a net operating income test. And so if that can be, the lender's going to look at it as a business, and as long as it's profitable, they're going to fund it. You'll need to be able to backstop it with some amount of net worth, and the ratio is usually about 25%. So about 25% of your the value of the building would need to be supported with a net worth. So you do need to be able to back some of it up. So that's one of the things that's really obvious, is that when people are trying to struggle with financing boundaries, right? So when they're hitting limits on what they can actually borrow, moving into some form of commercial real estate is a completely different way that lenders look at it. The other thing that you'll notice that's different when you get into commercial, and I remember my first commercial property, I was so naive, right? I just kind of went in, I started, I figured, okay, it was a 6-unit building. And, what I had purchased before that was 4 units or less. So it was, when I got to 6, it was a different ball of wax. And the next thing you find out is, when you're buying something that's 4 units or less, typically the lender is going to pay almost all the fees for you, with the exception of your own lawyer fees. When you get to the commercial property, not only do you pay for your own lawyer fees, they're more expensive lawyers' fees. You pay the lender's lawyer's fees in most cases as well. And the shock is that what you pay your own lawyers is maybe about 1/3 to half of what the lender's lawyer costs. You have to pay for your own appraisal. You may have to pay for a phase 1 environmental. as well. Sometimes you get away with an environmental questionnaire, and often those things are negotiable, by the way. So just because the lender asks you for something, that doesn't mean you have to do that. You can always discuss it with them. So now, what else do you end up paying? You might be paying a lender's fee. That's another one that's fun. So we see that in private mortgages, but we also see that in commercial mortgages too. And it's not unusual for it to be like a 1% lender fee involved. You may be paying broker fees, whereas on the residential side, typically the broker fee is paid by the lender. On the commercial side, some lenders will pay the broker fee. In a lot of cases, you end up paying the broker fee. So what you're getting from this is that when you get on the commercial side, there's a lot of fees. There's a lot of expenses that you have to do as part of the overall transaction. But what you realize too is that's actually kind of the normal situation. When you're dealing with the retail mortgages, that's arguably the more unusual scenario, right, where everything is paid for you. So that is the second key area, is fees. The third would be that the way that buildings are evaluated, or valued, I should say, in terms of their price to market. So on a commercial property, it is primarily driven by its net operating income and an effective cap rate in that particular area, and that asset class and the condition of the asset. So when an appraisal is done, as we know, there's three main ways that appraisals are done: a direct comparison, income-based approach, and a cost-up approach. So on a commercial building, things are typically driven by a income approach, whereas on the residential side of things, it's typically on a direct comparison basis. And then one is used as a backup to the other. So what you get out of that is that if you're dealing with single family homes, for example, that is largely driven based on what's happening in the general retail market, and less about the performance that improvement that you do as a rental building. Whereas on the commercial side, it's largely about the income, right? And then it's backed up by direct comparison. So, I think it's always good for, even in my portfolio, I have some single families, and I kind of like them because they tend to be very liquid. You can sell them off in a hurry if you need to, whereas a commercial building will have a longer sales cycle. And plus, they get the benefit from the general market appreciation on that side. So I'd say those are the three key differences between those asset classes. I have to go turn off the vacuum robot. Pick a bad time.
Darcy, did you have something you wanted to add to that in terms of the differences you've noticed when you're, moving up from the, 1 to 4 unit sort of space into the larger space?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on maybe the cost of renovations. If you're over budget, let's say you're doing a single family home and you're doing the bathroom and you pay $50 too much for the tub, that's not the end of the world. But if you're renovating a 20 or 30 unit building and then you pay $50 a unit too much for the tubs, that adds up. And then you pay a little too much for the painting and a little too much for the flooring, and pretty soon you're talking some real numbers. So just watch the power of leverage positively and negatively as you move up as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely a great point. And yeah, that's, I think, a lesson that a lot of investors have kind of learned the hard way, that, $50, in a single family is nothing, but $50 in a 40 unit building, it definitely cuts into your budget in a large way.
But similarly too, right, when you think about risk management of lost rent, right, if you have one single family home, right, then, if you don't have any revenue coming in, that's 100% revenue loss on that. Whereas in a multifamily building, you're dealing with, one vacancy is really just, 1 of 4 or 1 of 10 or 1 of 40.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I find financing is horrendous right now anyways, but certainly in the multi-unit space, it's painful. I mean, CMH, if you want CMHC financing, you're looking at probably 6 to 9 months for them to be able to fund a deal on a multi-unit building these days.
There's a lot of paperwork, but I would honestly say that I find it, so I'm a professional investor, okay? So I don't have a traditional income source. So what I find for me to be able to finance smaller properties is much harder than it is for me to finance commercial properties. And so, and I find sometimes the timelines on them are not dissimilar.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a reminder, people are asking questions. If you guys don't mind, if you have questions that you would like us to be able to tackle before the end, if you can please put them at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A. If you guys don't mind throwing them in the Q&A there, because if you're putting your questions in the chat box, by the time we have a chance to answer them, they might get lost in the shuffle, and we don't want that to happen. So if you don't mind, if you have posted a question in the chat box, do a copy paste, throw the question into the Q&A, and we will be sure to do our best to be able to answer it for you. That being said, there is someone who asked, how do novice investors make the jump into commercial and land development? So that might be a good sort of transition question. How did you guys make the transition? How did you go from, okay, I'm buying, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes to I'm buying a 6 unit? Was it just kind of the opportunity came up and that was how you made the transition and you kind of learned some of the lessons the hard way? Because, I just realized all three of us are coaches too. So we spend a lot of time talking to people about, hey, these are the mistakes I made. Don't make these ones. Here's how you do things the way that we figured out works better. Darcy, did you want to take that question first?
Sure. Actually, I was about 3 renovations in on my career doing single family homes, and I got the opportunity to buy a 1910 one of those old kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of those mansions, what used to be a really nice house back in the day, but it had fallen apart, and it was actually turned into a boarding house where each of the units had to go down the hall to use the bathroom. And I was able to visualize a way where you could actually get each unit to have its own bathroom and its own kitchen. So like 4 renovations in, I was tackling this big monster property. I ended up with actually another recession that hit Alberta about the same time. So I ended up keeping this unit and ended up turning it into a rental. It was 21 units. So I went from basically never having done anything before to doing a 21 unit building. I don't necessarily recommend that, but that's how it happened to me.
Yeah, I think a lot of our stories start out, I don't necessarily recommend, here's what I learned from this experience. That's pretty awesome. I like that story. That's a good one. What about you, Christian? How did you, what was your thought on how you made the transition?
Well, I'll tell you that in a second, but I just want to make sure that people understand that when it comes to real estate, time has this habit of healing a lot of mistakes.
Oh, yes.
So, I think one of the things that we have is a fear to move to the next step. And in reality, while it might be gut-wrenching at times and it might be challenging, if you make some mistakes along the way, maybe you don't optimize the return, right? But you have a limited amount of downside. It's not that you can't make tragic mistakes, right? So, but if you at least plan things out, you're not going to make any really horrible mistakes.
Yeah, and if you're planning on holding for a while, then it sort of smooths it out too a little bit. If you're not in one of the strategies where you're like, okay, I need to sell it, 5 minutes after I finish the renovation, then we get a little bit of time to sort of absorb some of the bumps in the road.
Yeah, so my story is probably not completely dissimilar from Darcy's in that I just started buying them because I didn't think they were any different than anything else, honestly. My very first building was a 4-unit building, and then my second building was a 6-unit building, which I later converted to a 9. But it's, I just kind of move forward and you discover what you need to do. Is like what I was saying when I bought that 6-unit building. That was my first commercial property with all the commercial processes around it. And fortunately, I had a very good banker who in the commercial mortgage group who kind of handheld me through this and was very patient, and the seller was very patient as well. It was a private deal. It was not a listed deal in that particular scenario. And I think that was helpful because once I learned the ropes on that and understood exactly what that process was, for me, it was once I went commercial, I really never looked back. It just became the way to really scale things in a much more efficient fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what, once you get a couple of sort of the smaller deals done, you look at it and you go, okay, well, I can do this. And then you go, but why am I doing it on a duplex?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you start going, if I can buy 6 units. And what I find a lot of times is the price per unit on the smaller buildings is higher than it is for the larger buildings. So you might buy a duplex for the same price that you're buying, a 5-unit building, because the cost per unit is so much lower with larger buildings.
That's a really good point. And the other thing I was going to add there is, before I became a professional real estate investor, I was in the tech sector. And one of the responsibilities I had was mergers and acquisitions. So one of the things that I discovered there, and it's true when it comes to real estate, is the amount of effort required to acquire something is almost the same, whether it's a small thing or a big thing. So while there's more diligence that you have to do on the really big things, if you're thinking about the diligence you have to do on a single family home or a duplex versus what you're going to have to do on a 10-unit or a 20-unit building, the amount of work is shockingly similar.
I'd like to just maybe throw a little caveat in there too. So typically with a single family home, you're dealing with like a furnace and a smaller hot water tank, and the roof is pitched with shingles. When you get into multifamily, typically you're dealing with a boiler system and larger hot water tanks, baseboard heating, and the roofs are typically flat. So there is a kind of a learning curve to get used to the building itself and how they're put together. So.
Absolutely. And I think, we're going to talk about power teams in a little bit, but I think this is where, and you mentioned, Christian, that your realtor was very patient and helpful. This is where having the right people around you is really important. People who know how things happen and how things need to be done when you're in a place where you don't know that yet. So I think finding the right people to put on your team is huge as well.
Yeah, it was my banker, not my realtor. That was a private deal on that one.
Oh, right. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, you mentioned that. Perfect. So tell us about your light industrial, Christian. I know you love your light industrial because you talked about it. So tell us what that is and why you like it so much as a class of commercial for you.
Sure. Right. I mean, to be, full disclosure, I'd say about 70% of my holdings is in multifamily residential. Okay. And then the rest is a mix of light industrial, some office, and some retail space. So what I like so if you think about the different classes of assets and you see what the top performing ones are from a cash flow perspective, light industrial is usually at the top of the list, followed by storage, and then followed by commercial residential buildings. So what I like about light industrial is that they're just great little cash machines. You hold it, and as long as you can keep the vacancy rate reasonably low, the thing just throws and spits cash at you all day long. And the first light industrial building that I bought was one of the things that really kind of kept our business alive, because we were renovating all kinds of things at the time, and we were spending a lot of money. And it was the first light industrial building that kept a lot of the lights on. So that's one of the reasons I like it. It doesn't appreciate as much as, say, residential does, usually because what happens is as demand increases, capacity comes in. People start building to suit for those particular asset classes. But so when things don't appreciate that well, they usually generate a lot better cash flow. And cap rates of 8 to 10 would not be unusual at all in that business. So the other thing that most people ask is, well, what is light industrial? And light industrial, the best way to think about it is think of a building that has a bunch of garage bay doors on it. These might be 12-foot doors or even bigger, that they have relatively high ceilings as well. And it's where trades would typically set up shop. So they would have their trucks there, they'd have materials there. Think of electricians, plumbers, home renovators, anything along those lines. That's the class, even, alarm companies, telephone companies. So what they need is a place to store stuff, a big bay to be able to load things in and out, and sometimes store some of their equipment and even their trucks inside those bays. So that's often how you recognize them.
Awesome. Thank you, Christian. Our next question has to do with financing, because we know as investors, it is probably one of the biggest challenges. It's also one of those moving targets, you know, what it was like to finance buildings, you know, 2 years ago, a year ago, 6 months ago, and right now it changes all the time. So the question specifically that we prepared was, what is our preferred way to finance commercial properties? But there's been a couple of other people who have sort of mentioned, you know, joint ventures. And Christian, I know joint ventures is not something you do. Is it something you do, Darcy? Is that how you finance some of your investment opportunities in order to, you know, cut down the amount of capital you need to put into each deal you do?
I have done, yes, a lot of joint ventures in the past, yeah, actually.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Did you have something you wanted to add, Darcy, in terms of sort of how financing works for land development? That would probably be really helpful.
In land development, yeah, I've got a couple of things that are specific to land development. I wrote some notes down here. Typically, looking at from the bank standpoint, they kind of look at 5 different things. They look at the equity available, and it's actually a lower loan to value, so probably around 65% loan to value to do pure land development. What's the strength of the covenant strength of the actual partners or a guarantor? They'll look at the developer's experience. So kind of a scale of the project compared to the scope of experience within the developer's group. They like to see the profit. They typically like to see about 15 to 20% profit in there. You know, if you're less than that, then they kind of look skeptically that you're not including something, or sorry, that there's not enough profit in there to actually make the thing work if you run into troubles. And if you're more than that, then they're kind of skeptical that you've left out something on the cost side. And then pre-sales, you probably usually have to get some sort of pre-sale to hit a target in order to get financing for either a land development or a new construction project.
Interesting. And that makes it quite different than financing with commercial, where with commercial financing, multi-units and light industrial and that kind of stuff, then it's just about going out and collecting the information and proving to the bank that this property brings in the income it needs to in order for you to qualify for the financing. Development, it sounds like you're really, it's almost like you're building more of a case and saying, this is what we're going to do, and this is my history, and this is my experience, and this is why I think you should trust me with your money.
Yeah, and then the lender says that's all fine and good. Now prove it by actually getting someone to put a non-refundable deposit check down. Actually, the first larger project, land development deal I did, I was doing a 36 unit bungalow villa project for the plus 50 crowd. So it was 18 physical buildings and 36 units. And I had to get, at that time it was a 25% pre-sale. The great thing about Alberta is because we have these booms and busts, is you might be in a period where they don't care about pre-sales. Like it's going so, the economy is just so crazy that they just know you're going to sell, or it could be 25%. I've seen as high as 75% in the middle of a recession kind of thing. So you're kind of never know what your pre-sale target's going to be until you actually sit in front of a banker or a lender.
Wow, that's really interesting. Is CMHC an option for land development? Do they have any appetite for those kinds of deals, or CMHC really wants you to have the physical asset already built before they'll extend their?
In my experience, that they like an actual physical structure that they can hang their hat to. So.
Yeah, CMHC needs to either be dealing with an actual fixture on site or be in the process of developing the fixture. I'm involved in land itself without the fixture. Yeah. So there's some products that CMHC will underwrite that'll go up to 95% loan to cost as part of a fixture or building development. They're not fun to do, and most mortgage brokers will tell you, you know what, it's not worth the extra, 5 to 10% that you would otherwise just be able to get under more conventional fashion.
Yeah, because the biggest problem or the biggest complaint with CMHC is they might go 85 or 90 or 95% of the value of the building, but what they see as the value of the building is going to be much less than a conventional lender. So it typically ends up roughly in the same ballpark anyways.
Yeah, for refinances, that's absolutely true. So, you know, a conventional loan lender will go to say 75% loan to value on a refi, whereas CMHC will go to 85%. But to Darcy's point, CMHC is so conservative with their numbers that you'll probably still get the 75% loan to value.
Yeah.
But the benefit is that you get an insured mortgage, which means that the interest rate will be lower, right? Usually it's a full point lower, and you can get longer amortization periods. So that's where you can get, for example, you know, some of my buildings have 40-year amortizations, which means then that you're paying a lot less principal, and the building will cash flow a lot better. So.
And the other thing about CMHC, the benefit of CMHC is their mandate is they have to fund all over the country. So if you get into some really small towns and villages, even, you know, a conventional lender might say, yeah, we're not going there. Where CMHC, if they say, yeah, we'll back you on it, you can get financing where it might not be even possible conventionally to buy in some of these smaller centers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true.
Now, Elizabeth, Ray Gauthier had a question that I think was in line with what your question was in terms of financing. Shall we give that one a shot?
Sure. This is, so many of the commercial residential buildings I see are underperforming, which by definition means the income isn't at the building's potential until improvements and renovations are made. What strategies do you have to secure financing for these properties? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes. I thought it was a great question, actually.
It is. It's a fantastic question.
Yeah, and it kind of dovetails with a question that you have, which is, you know, a lot of properties don't cash flow right now. So how do you deal with it? Yeah. So for me, I always look at any acquisition as a total business case, right? So if the property doesn't cash flow now, I have a plan to do a redevelopment on it, a repositioning, whatever it happens to be, to get to highest and best use. And then I have that business case at the end. So it'll always cash flow when I'm done with it. And usually I have a timeline of 18 to 24 months. So with that in mind, if you then work backwards from there, the question is, who's going to finance your project overall? And if you just look at it as financing the acquisition of the asset, and then later on thinking about how you're trying to finance all the renovation work, et cetera, that's where you start to run into trouble. So you have to look at the project in its entirety. And there are lenders that will work with you in terms of working out the total plan. So private market is one where, you know, private lenders will certainly do quite a bit for you. The costs with private lenders tend to be a little bit higher. But I've also found certain lenders, for example, I'm doing one more recently with Equitable Bank. And what they will do is they'll finance the purchase. So as long as the appraisal comes out to something reasonable, based largely on a direct comparison. So even if the rents are low, they will allow you to use market rents in order to value the building as part of the appraisal. And they'll loan you, you know, in that case was 75% loan to purchase price. And then what they do is I'll tell them, okay, now here's the overall business plan. And when I'm done, the building will be worth X, right? So they effectively the after repair value. And this is how much I have to put into it in order to get it there. And they'll loan me 2/3 of the money required for the renovation. And it's done like a construction loan. So there are draws along the way. So you can have multiple draws. So you start with the renovation cost, you put certain improvements in, you demonstrate that, those improvements, and then they loan you more money, right, in consideration for what you've put into the property. And you just keep doing that as a series of draws, just like when you're doing a construction project. So there are lenders that have these types of products. They're, you know, in that particular case, the interest rate is only 5.45% versus what you would do on a private deal, which would be more expensive. And on that one, it's interest only as well. So it reduces the amount that you have to pay out on any given month. So you can factor the carrying costs into your overall budget.
That's a pretty sweet little product you found yourself there, Christian.
A good mortgage broker can solve a lot of complex problems for you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's important here to sort of address, I know in the world of real estate, a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about OPM, which of course is other people's money. And then by extension of that, people talk a lot about joint ventures And one of the common questions we get is, when is the right time to start doing joint ventures? My personal position, and I'm interested to hear what you two think as well, but I prefer to max out on what I can do myself before I look at bringing in joint venture partners. So I'll do what I can with my own qualifying, with my own funds. I'll do as many deals or as much business as I can. My next step would then be to move into the private, because at that point I'm, paying 8, 10, 12% for money. And then my last resort typically is going the JV route, because at that point you're giving up usually 50% equity, and you're giving up, some of your ability to function autonomously, to make decisions quickly and easily. There's a lot of different levels or layers of complexity that you add in when you take on the joint venture partners. So that for me is a step that I take when I've exhausted all my other financing options. Is that something that you would agree with, Darcy, or do you head right to joint ventures and private money and that kind of stuff?
No, I would agree with what you said. Yeah, because the incremental costs of the overall cost of the funds gets pretty steep if you're paying 50%. The other thing I'd add that too is, and I was guilty of this too, so this is one of those don't do what I did back in the day kind of stories, but I'm a real lone wolf guy, so I tried to do everything myself, and I've seen the value since then, and I do it better now, of actually having not necessarily JV partners, but other people working with you. And even when you start out, maybe it's a brother or a friend or something, because we can't, as much as we think we can do everything ourselves. Like, there's just so much to do in a real estate deal that you should find someone whose skills are complementary to yours, skills that you don't have. Kind of like the good-looking property brothers on TV. One's good with the design and the sales, the other guy's the swing the hammer guy.
Yeah.
If you can get that, it benefits you in being able to do different deals and having less chance of a catastrophic screw up in one of your deals, but also then it gives you better chance to arrange financing too, because now there's the strength of 2 or 3 kind of partners going and doing this stuff as a team. So I think there's multiple benefits to not going it alone.
For sure. And what you're talking about is adding a business partner as opposed to a deal partner, which exactly. I think is a great way to look at it too, right? Because that's one of the challenges with JV partners is every deal you do is different. And if you're constantly looking at a different partner, then you've got to set expectations, and you've got to find your partners, and you've got to, train them. This is what my business looks like. And you're working everything out. Whereas when you've chosen a business partner with a complementary skill set, then you're able to scale your operations and you're able to replicate things in the same way.
Yeah, I think it's really sage advice. And while I don't take other people's, I don't give equity to people for my own investments. I do put equity into other people's investments. So I am a partner in other people's projects. And the way I kind of got into that, to be fair, is exactly where Darcy was going. I have a friend who started doing investment. He's an experienced real estate investor, and we have a mutual respect for each other. And so what he did was even though he's very knowledgeable, he has no ego. So he's quite aware that other people bring other skills to the table and then can contribute. So he doesn't give them a giant share of the equity. He says, I'd like you to buy in, but you may be buying in at 10%, right? And you might take on 3 or 4 advisors, if you will, right, that have an equity share. And what he's really doing in that is now you've got a vested interest in the outcome. And so, I contribute towards the project in terms of the forms of advice. But to be fair, I will never have control of the project. He always has control of the project. So I thought that was a very clever way of managing it, and at the same time having skills, right? Or getting the skills that you need into the project with a vested interest. And so I do place, money into other projects that way.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great way to do it too, because one of the biggest challenges is when you take on a JV partner and you're 50-50, who's the tiebreaker? And if you said, okay, well, I'm doing 49%, 49% to you and 51% to me, maybe your JV partner was like, no, I don't like that.
Yeah, well, that's why you have to have control clauses in any of those types of agreements, as you would for anything. So you can define who has, control, interest, in final decision making. But I think one area you're getting into is getting into a joint venture can be very much like getting into a marriage. right?
Yes, it
There's
is.
especially when there's a lot of money involved, people get kind of concerned.
Yes, and people want to know what you're doing with their money too.
Yeah, so you have to vet your partners very well. And, I think there's certain, investment models, things like rent-to-owns, for example, or flips, where a joint venture, at least there's a clean exit in a defined time period, that if things aren't working out, you can get out easily.
And that's typically what I've seen too, is the money partner is typically happy to kind of sit back in the background while things are going well. But if things start to go south, then they kind of come to the fore and start to want to make the decisions at that point. So that's kind of the cutover point as I've seen it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so that sort of ends the structured questions that we had for commercial. Why don't we jump into the land development section? And then we'll be able to go back and sweep up with some of the questions that we haven't already covered that people have asked in the Q&A box. So Darcy, the first question we had for land development is, what types of options are available to somebody who's just starting out in land development?
It's a good question. I think a lot of people are scared of land development. And just as an aside, I kind of separate land development from new construction. So for me, land development takes a lot and gets it serviced and ready for a builder. A builder comes in, takes the service lot and actually builds on it. So that's what I'll talk about kind of today. So a lot of people are scared about land development because they think it's too hard, or it takes too much money, or you've got to have construction experience, or only the big guys can do it. And I'd like to kind of say there's ways to get into it where you don't have to do that. My first deal, for example, I was doing flips, and I had a single family bungalow. I was leaning over the fence talking to the neighbor. His dad had just passed away, the guy that owned that house. So I ended up buying his house as well. I had two side by side on fairly large lots. I moved the houses off, subdivided those two lots into four, and then ended up actually building 4 infills or semis, I think you guys call them in Ontario. And so that was my first deal. So can you find a large lot with an older house and move that off and subdivide it and build 2? Can you go the other way? Can you find 2 or 3 houses, kind of an older vintage, side by side, kind of merge that into one and then get it ready for an apartment building or something smaller like that? The other great thing I love about land development is that you don't have to physically do the construction side either. Like, you can do the paperwork, the dealing with the city part, the getting the permits part. You can get all the paperwork together and then sell that package to an actual land developer who's got the money or the capital to physically dig the trenches and put the pipe in the ground. So there's various aspects of it. What I would advise is, anytime you've got a kind of a large project that you're looking at that seems daunting, is break it down into smaller tasks, and then you attack each task separately. What I like to say about land development, to make it simple, is land development is really out with the old and in with the new. So basically, you're getting the land back to neutral by getting rid of whatever's there now, an existing house or garage or some trees or whatever. And then in with the new means you're putting in a road or some utilities or whatever. So if you kind of break it down like that into smaller chunks, you can convert that then to a to-do list that you can just tackle one piece at a time until you've got the project done. So land development doesn't have to be really daunting as some people think.
That's really interesting, because you actually really kind of simplify it there, where it's like step 1 is take the land back to neutral, and then step 2 is figure out the highest and best use for it and take that as far as you can based on your knowledge and your skill set that you have. So if it's just putting in the utilities or whatever you need to do that. But if you have the capability to do more, then you could.
Yeah, it's really, like, for example, I was heavily involved in getting the new horse track and casino built in Northeast Calgary. And it started out as farmland at $2,000 an acre. And now there's a regional shopping center, Cross Iron Mills, which is basically owned by the same company as Vaughan Mills in Ontario there. We've got the casino, the racetrack, Leon's, everything's there. Now land is going for, $800,000 an acre. Well, it doesn't just magically go from 2,000 to 800. There's intermediate steps. And maybe you're the person that takes it from this piece to that piece to add value. And then you make a bit of a profit off the value spread. And like I said, you can just do the paperwork permitting part a lot of the times and then sell it off to someone larger until you can build up some funds where you can start putting pipe in the ground too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anything to throw in there, Christian, before we go on? I want to talk about the typical costs we can anticipate.
Yeah, And just some minor things, I guess. One is that when people are thinking about land development, sometimes they're thinking about bringing it back to base, right? And often what you can do is there's often revenue sources on that land that you can have while you're going through the process, because the process itself of land development, all the way from planning, maybe rezoning, site plan control, etc., can take a bit of time. Especially a rezoning application could take up to 2 years. So you want to be able to have a revenue source in the meantime. Sometimes it could be something as simple as you've got a single family lot and you've got a house there right now. It may be a rundown house, but you just use that as a revenue stream to help pay for the mortgage of the land itself while you go through the process and before you tear that down. Or you might do a short-term land lease, for example, just allowing someone to use a piece of land as a parking lot, right, is another example of how you could do something in the meantime to guarantee revenue source. So I think that's probably what I would add there.
Awesome.
And just adding on to that, you can also, make some money off of cut your costs too. Like, for example, those two houses side by side that I have, I didn't have to actually pay to get those demolished and then trucked away. A house moving company approached me and they actually bought those two houses, jacked them up and took them away in a truck and actually paid me money to get rid of those houses. So I didn't even know that. They kind of just showed up on my doorstep one day and after I'd filed the demolition permit. So that was kind of a nice little benefit. I made a few thousand just for nothing there. So
that's pretty neat. And it also saves you in terms of having to find people and coordinate everything, just to have somebody show up and pay you a few $1,000 and take away your headache. I mean, it doesn't get better than that, does it?
And one other really funny story too is when I was doing the horse track, we had an old house, the original farmhouse there, and actually, we didn't have any money because we were in creditor protection at the time. So I actually had the local fire department use it as kind of a test. How they like to have simulations, and so they lit the building on fire, and then they actually all I had to do was pay to get the rubble taken away after, which was a lot cheaper than actually getting rid of the house in the first place. So I thought that was pretty unique.
Absolutely. Just goes to show a little creativity goes a long way, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Fantastic. So circling back then, Darcy, what kind of costs should we be if we find, a piece of property somewhere and we think this might be perfect for land development? What kind of costs should we be, making a list of and then putting some figures against?
There's a lot are the same as a normal. So, your land acquisition costs, your design fees, financing costs, marketing costs, those are kind of similar, contingency at the end. What's particular about kind of land development would be you'll have to have some city permit fees. So, the city wants a larger chunk of the revenue from these kind of things. In terms of actually on-site stuff, you'll need things like site security, online trailers, porta potties, generators, that kind of stuff. The other thing that gets really unique as you get into land development versus other stuff is surveying, kind of out with the old, in with the new. So you've got some demolition costs, removal of buildings and that. Site grading, soil compaction and testing, deep utility and shallow utilities. So the deep utilities are anything that deals with water, so it doesn't get frozen. So potable water in and sanitary and storm going out. Your shallow utilities, your gas and electrical and any of the phone and that kind of stuff. Tie-ins to city main utility lines, curbs, gutters, sidewalks, the actual interior road. If your lot's big enough, we actually have to do an interior road, streets or traffic lights. Maybe you have to deal with parks. You might have to build a park for the municipality, depending on how big the lot is. Landscaping, irrigation, trees and shrubs. Maybe there's a retaining wall that you've got to hold back some wall. Maybe you want to develop land where you've got walkout basements. So you might have to do some retaining walls that way. Then the other thing too is typically if you're doing parks or anything that has to do with your municipality, they make you maintain those parks for 2 years at your cost. And then they come in 2 years after and say, yeah, that tree, you have to replace that tree and that sprinkler head's broken. So you'll have to fix those before they'll actually take control. So you have to worry about, maintenance costs during that 2 year period. And then just site supervision and inspections. So those are kind of at a very high level, some of the costs you're going to go through.
That's considerable. There's a lot of line items there.
Yeah. So again, as you're starting out, keep it simple. Don't be your own on-site supervisor. I've always said that, the less you know about something, the stronger your team has to be. So make sure you've got a really good general contractor that actually takes on and manages that stuff. But in the background, you should also know what kind of the costs are, so you can watch over it and really appreciate what they're doing. Yeah, there's a lot involved for sure.
Absolutely. So is it your preference to take like a bare piece of land that has never been developed and to work with that? Or do you find it's actually easier to take a piece of land that already has like the services run there for one building, demo the building and build something bigger? Does that make sense?
If you're just starting out, it's probably easier to do something that's already exists. Like, for example, going back to those two side-by-side houses.
Mhm.
So if you think about it, there's two houses, so there's already two utility runs, two utility trenches that exist. You move the old houses off, you subdivide that into 4. So now 2 of the 4 lots will already be serviced. You just have to worry about servicing the other 2. So if you're just starting out, I would kind of maybe go at it that way. That's a lot easier. As you get larger, obviously, there's less and less land available of any size in any of the interior cities and anywhere in Canada. So you're probably dealing with something on the outskirts of town and that's where kind of the big boys get involved, because there's a lot of money to run big roads and utility lines out to the middle of nowhere. So.
Oh, absolutely.
And land development, though, I mean, what you're talking about largely is about creating subdivisions and things of that nature. But in the inner core, you're right, there's less land available. So the strategy in the inner core is more about upzoning instead. So taking stuff that might be R1, R2 type zoning and converting it up to, say, an R4, potentially even an R5 type zoning. And simply the process of changing the zoning level increases the value of the land. So you often, in order to get the rezoning, of course, you have to go through and create a plan for the building that you're going to have, because that's actually what gets approved for the rezoning before you hand it off to the developer. But purely doing that process of getting it to the point where now it's not an R1 zoned area, but now it's an R4 or an R5 type zoned piece of land, because now you have an increased number of units that you can put on that same piece of land. The land itself becomes fundamentally more valuable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Did you have something you wanted to add, Darcy?
Yeah, I was just saying that's a great point, Christian. The other thing to watch out for in that scenario too, though, is to make sure that what you want to do with that land is relatively close. The zoning for the new model is relatively close to the old one. Municipalities don't really like to, if you have a dream of putting a 10-story apartment building in a bunch of, in an area that's got nothing but bungalows around it, you're probably going to get shot down on that. So people need to be aware that you've got to stay close. But other times you can even cross zoning too. Like if a residential area, if the city and the community kind of see that they're missing some shopping, for example, the city might be open to having a vacant lot change from residential to small commercial, so you can put up a little strip mall or something. So those kind of opportunities are available too, as long as the municipality and the community is on board, and that's kind of what they want.
That's right. If it's part of the official plan, for example, and in Calgary you've got a light rail system. Ottawa is developing a light rail system here as well, and if you, with the new official plan in Ottawa, for example, if you're building, I think it's within 800 meters of an LRT station, they are very open to rezoning applications, right? So even if it's an R1 or an R2 zone, if you want to take it to an R4 and it's within certain parameters, as you're saying, Darcy, then they're actually quite open. But you're absolutely right. You're not going to put an R5 type tower in a suburban residential neighborhood. So.
The other thing too, I was just going to say that I was working on a piece of land in a residential area here in Calgary, and I phoned the city councilor to see if he had a problem. I wanted to put a car wash in a certain area, and they said, I don't have a problem as long as the city administration's on board. So I phoned city administration. They say, I don't have a problem as long as the community league is on board. And so I phoned the community league president, and he said, you know what, we don't really want a car wash there. We've always kind of thought a restaurant would be better there. So if you read between the lines, it shows you the power of the community leagues versus the actual politicians these days. And B, it says, yeah, we're not gonna help you get your car wash in, But then C, reading between the lines, you know, if you change quickly and say, okay, well, I guess I'll do a restaurant, then you would have had support at all levels and it would have gone through much quicker. So the trick is to kind of talk to all levels involved and just see what they need. Kind of the need is always kind of the first thing you should attack first, as opposed to, you know, I've always wanted to build a 10-story tower. I'm going to ram it home here. If you want to build a 10-story tower, then find land that supports a 10-story tower. So.
I think that's a great point, because I know in Ontario, there's quite a bit going on right now with coach houses. And there's a lot of kind of that NIMBYism, right? Well, you know, we understand that we need more housing, and we understand that, you know, there's you know, supply and demand issues, but you know, I just don't want it on my street, and I don't want it in my backyard, and I don't want more people living around me, and I don't want, you know, my density increasing. So I think that's a great point, is that, you know, it's a lot easier to get things done when you have the support of the community around you, and you're not, you know, the lone salmon trying to swim upstream, trying to push through a building that nobody else wants.
You've got, but NIMBY is the old one, banana is the new one. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything.
I love it. I'm going to use that.
That's awesome. I think you might have to do a little social media post about that, Darcy. I haven't seen. Oh, Mark's already stolen it.
Yeah, Mark's good that way.
Yeah, he's gonna copyright that one. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so who do you need on your power team? You know, you talked about a ton of like costs that you need to factor in. Who do you go to for help when you're working on your first land development deal? Yeah,
so again, the less you know, the better your team has to be, and your team has to be experienced in what you're trying to do. If you're doing light industrial, as Christian was talking about before, you want to deal with people that have already experienced in that area. So you start out with your realtor, because your realtor is going to help you find your need. Like I said, just because you think something should be done doesn't mean your community needs it. So you're going to need a really good realtor to find out what the need is. And then you're going to go, you'll need to finance it. So again, a strong mortgage broker that's experienced in that area. And typically with a land development, the really important piece is a civil engineer. So there's different types of engineers: electrical, structural. Civil engineers is the group of people that kind of do this. They deal with roads and that kind of design. And then at the end, they're actually going to be the ones that kind of manage the on-site work after. So you really need a strong civil engineer. And then you might need an architect. As Christian was talking about, if you're upselling or upzoning, you're going to have a rendering done of showing just at a very high level what you're kind of thinking of involved. So there might be an architect involved, but not necessarily. And then the other one is a cost consultant, someone who actually puts some really firm costs next to all those line items that we had. Typically, the larger civil engineers will have one of those on staff, so you can kind of, one-stop shop. But if not, you're going to have to find a cost consultant, because typically a lot of this stuff is the cost of a lot of this stuff is known. Like in any specific town or city at any given time, it's known that it costs so much per linear meter to put in asphalt, or so much per linear foot to do this or that, or so much a square foot. So these cost consultants at a very high level know this. And then as you get further along the line, past the point where, okay, this is for sure, I'm going to do this, then they'll actually go out and get quotes from the various sub-trades to actually from that. But you kind of start at a high level at the cost stage to figure some of this out.
You need some deep pockets for land development.
If you're going to do the physical building part, if you're just doing like the paperwork part, you don't necessarily need, you're basically, the trick is how are you tying up the land? You're physically buying the land first. There's some risk to that. If you don't get permitting, then you're stuck with land. So can you tie the land up with an option or agreement for sale? Can you do a long-term, an actual real purchase, but with a long condition date? So maybe, give yourself lots of time to kind of get the permits and stuff that you need. Typically, you're probably less than 20 or 25,000 if you're just dealing with a very high level site maps and site plans from an engineer, and then maybe a little bit of an option purchase price. So you don't necessarily have to go in with a huge wallet to start up.
Awesome, that's great information. Thank you for sharing that, Darcy. Christian, anything to add before I ask Darcy the final question, and then we can jump over to the Q&A box, because I think there were some great questions over there for sure.
No, I don't want to take away from actually some really sage advice that that Darcy just put forward. So let's move on to the next question.
All right, that's awesome. So the final question is, when you are looking for a piece of property to use for land development purposes, what do you look for? What are sort of the basics? Like, obviously, okay, I could buy this land, you know, it's a double wide lot. That might be something that you say right off the bat, okay, I have a house here, I could sever it, I could build something else over here. What are sort of the other kind of low hanging fruit that people can look for when they're thinking about getting into some land development in their area?
Yeah, no, for sure. As we talked about kind of needs first, do a needs analysis first. I'd actually go up a step right from the lot. Like, what's the municipality doing? Like, is there a ton of red tape? Because different municipalities, I can tell you, I've dealt with 9 different cities and counties in Alberta, and I can tell you there's a big discrepancy. I have some fourplexes in a very small town. It's about 500 people called Caroline, Alberta, and I had a lot. So I went to the double wide trailer that asked for the village town hall, and I talked to the lady. I said, "What does it take to get a building permit?" And they said, "If you just draw something on a napkin, then Vern, the city manager, and I'll discuss it over lunch." So that's the one aspect. And then, you know, dealing in Vancouver, it's like 2 years to get a permit. So how structure and how much red tape is there in the municipality is kind of a really big thing. Is your town or city dying, or is it actually on the move? So do people want to move in? I'd look at demographics, depending on what you want to build. Specifically, if you're building or developing something specific to age, student housing or seniors housing, what are the demographics? You don't want to go into an area that doesn't have people that for what you want to build. And then if you specifically get to the land itself, you're looking for the physical attributes, the topography. Is it hilly? Is it flat? How much work am I going to have to do to kind of go where I need it to be? Can you use the entire site? Is there a part of the land that's not available? Potential irritants. Is it smelly? Is it next door to a plastics factory or something? You don't worry about that. Any legal issues with the lot itself? If you're doing something residential, how safe is the area? And for that, I basically recommend that you visit the site 3 different times. One during a weekday, one during the weekend, and once at night, so you can kind of just get a good feel for the site. There's something called an approach zone. So that's the road you take to get to the actual site. So what's your feel? What kind of vibes you're getting as you drive to the site itself? And then once you get to the site, not only what's your first impression, but also turn around and start looking around and who else is around, what's your neighbors like. If you're getting into commercial and industrial, you want to be close to roads and means of access. Maybe you're specifically used as a train or a railroad, how close are you to that? Can big trucks turn around? Is there enough room? Commercial is also, parking is a really big deal for office and that. So you don't want to buy a piece of land that's too small so that, basically the building takes up the entire thing and then there's no room for parking. The other thing you're going to want to worry about is, even though you're maybe just doing the development and you're not physically building or doing the pipe in the ground or anything, you have to have an idea of what the end use is going to be, who the end user is, so you can make sure that your land is properly prepared for that person. Specifically, if it's industrial or kind of some of the heavy uses, you want to make sure that there's enough electricity. The electrical load is fine. You're maybe dealing with single phase and 3-phase, which is a lot different than just normal residential. Maybe water use is whatever the end user is has a really high water use. So you need to be available, kind of open to those kind of things too. If it's residential, you want to be close to schools and close to shopping. Is there something in the way? If you're doing a commercial property, for example, you could be looking, right over there is a whole big mass of people. That looks great. But if there's a railroad or a lake or a river and people have to drive 3 miles either way to get to your commercial spot, they're probably going to go to something closer. And then the final thing I would say is that people think in terms of time and not distance. So, it takes me 20 minutes to get to work. It doesn't, my work's not five miles away. So always think in terms of time. How close is my lot to whatever my potential user base is? Make sure you're close to that. So.
That's huge. Like, that was so much information compressed into like the last 3 minutes. I'm really glad this is recorded so I can go back and write down all these considerations. And I like that last one too, because it shows such insight into us as humans, right? Where we're more concerned about time than we are about the distance. If
only all of that was written down in a book somewhere, that would be really good.
Oh, you have a book, don't you, Darcy?
I do have a book.
That's awesome.
Sorry. I was just going to add, what Darcy's talking about in general is very good in anything that you're doing. So it's really about target market analysis. So Darcy said it well earlier, where he said, it's not about what you want to build, but what the community needs, and also what the potential clients of your building, right? Are they going to be there, right? And who are you focusing on? And it doesn't matter whether it's a light industrial building, whether it's single family homes, whether it's apartment buildings, and how you configure those apartment buildings. Are they going to be 1-bedroom units, bachelors, 2 bedrooms? What the mix is going to be is you need to take a look at the demographics in that particular area and the demand in that particular area of what's actually required. So some people will go in and say, well, I'm going to build a bunch of 3-bedroom apartments. And when you take a look at it, so, well, the demand for that is either going to be large families or students. And if that's not what's actually attracted to that particular area, then you may be completely missing something and get better revenue per square foot by going after 1-bedrooms and bachelors instead in that area. If you're in the suburbs and you're planning to build a bunch of bachelor apartments, you might be missing the boat completely, because it's typically where families are going to head to, and their larger units make more sense. So at the end of the day, it's about analyzing the target market on that one side. And I also like what Darcy was saying in terms of servicing to a particular property. It's an area, and it's one of the reasons that a lot of communities go through a process called site plan control. And it's very much about determining the load on the services. So you may want to put, a big building there, or a light industrial building, or some form of industrial building or commercial building. But if the municipality doesn't have the ability to service it in that area, you're not going to be able to bring those services in without extreme cost. So that's something that ends up happening there. And then there's also, as he was talking about with things like power, right? Well, does the utility, for example, Hydro One or Hydro Ottawa, do they have the ability to service what you need? Because they may just shut it right down and say, no, you might want to put something there, and there might actually be demand for that right now, but we don't have the ability to service that in the foreseeable future. So, yeah.
And one thing you could do, typically, not necessarily if you're just taking a lot, splitting it in two and building another couple of houses, but as you get a little bit bigger, you're going to want to do like a pre-development or pre-application meeting with the city. Yeah. And you'll submit your plans, you'll pay a little bit of money, and they'll spread it out to the various departments, right? So transportation will take a look at it, sanitation will take a look at it, education, all these groups, they'll say, how big of load or how big of impact is that going to be on my area of the city? And they might say, especially because especially out west here, we have a lot of urban sprawl where we've just got a lot of land. So, things keep just kind of growing out and out. And it costs the city more and more and more to get buses out there and to deal with water treatment and that kind of stuff. So that gives you a chance to sit in front of the city and see their concerns before you really spent any great deal of money. And you can get their feedback too, right? Like, say, if you change this and this, we'd be on board, but the way it sits now, we're not going to support it, kind of thing.
So it sounds like there really is a good amount of legwork that you need to do before you get into land development in terms of researching. Most people, I would imagine, function in sort of their immediate, community or their immediate city as their first go-to option. So you really need to connect with the people in your local city and determine if that's a viable option. And then if it's not, then you start looking at opportunities that are further afield.
Right. And actually right now, like I'm, as you get older, you get your ability to deal with stuff gets less and less. So I'm not liking the way the permit times have changed in Calgary over the last 20 years. So I'm starting, I'm actively looking for land down in the United States, for example, Texas and in Florida, for it to be precise. But just real quick, when I first did a permit application back in 2001, the checklist was a page and a half, and you had to submit 3 blueprints, and you got your result back in like 3 or 4 weeks. Now it's 11 pages is the checklist. You have to sign another 6 forms that said, you've never had asbestos on the site, or there's never been an oil well drilled on the site, for example. You have to submit 15 blueprints, and you can expect to wait 6 or 8 months now. So that's just kind of an example of how things have changed in 20 years in Calgary. So,
wow. And it's amazing that you've been around long enough to see those changes. I'm sure you've outlasted many of the staff that actually work in the departments.
Not really, you'd be surprised. But so,
well, that's interesting. Okay.
that's
All right, so there's a couple of questions here in the Q&A box that I think are fairly quick, and some of them we might have already answered, and then there's some that I think will take a little more time. So let's start with the ones that we can, that I think will be quick. So Mark was saying, Darcy, what city do you find value in right now for the multis? So I guess Mark is specifically looking at Alberta.
Alberta, okay. Basically, I would stick to, I was all over the place. So I basically built or owned in 6 different cities around Calgary or around Alberta. When you get a boom and a bust, the tertiary markets and the secondary markets really get hit hard. So you're best to stay in kind of the main Calgary and Edmonton kind of frames. That being said, there's a lot of money coming in from Ontario now, and that's kind of where it's going. And it's going to new projects as opposed to older stuff. Like people like the new in Alberta.
Interesting. Yeah, that is pretty cool. And you got guys like Mark Loeffler, who are, he's got quite a YouTube channel, and he's talking about flying out there. He's been out there a couple of times in the last few months looking at buildings and buying and that kind of stuff. So when you see some of the big guys doing stuff like that, then you know that a lot of other investors will follow suit to see what's going on out there as well. Because your Residential Tenancy Act is a lot more favorable than ours as well.
Probably, I think it's kind of the best in the province from the landlord side. Just as an example, you can raise the rents whatever you want to be once a year. So you're not limited in terms of rent control or anything like that. You're just limited more in terms of timing. But every year you can adjust however you want.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the big things that new investors, when you're looking at investing in strategies that involve tenants in any province, I think one of the fundamental pieces that we need to be doing is looking at the Residential Tenancy Act, because those are the laws that govern our business. And those are the people who have control over how and what we're doing. So for people who are, and I see it all the time, unfortunately, in landlord groups, for people who are saying, well, I wanted to do this with the property and now I found out that I can't. We need to be better prepared as investors. That's on us for not doing our due diligence before we decided to buy. So there are risks inherently involved with any investment strategy, but I think doing the proper research in advance really can reduce some of the risks so that we know what we're signing up for.
The other great thing about Alberta too is we've got something called the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service. So rather than the landlord suing the tenant or the tenant suing the landlord or something, for $75, you can file with the province, state your case. There's an actual form on the internet that you just fill in the blanks. Mm-hmm. So let's say a tenant doesn't pay for a couple of months, and I've issued the 14-day notice, and I've done all that. I can go online. Depends on the timing, but typically right now they're running about 3 weeks, where you get actually a phone call, and you can actually the tenant yourself and this person from the government can just be online, and you both state your case, and the actual dispute resolution officer actually has the power of the court to make a decision at that time. So you're not dealing with months or years trying to get a tenant out like you would be in some other provinces. So it's a really nice system. And sometimes it works against you, sometimes it's for you, but at least it's quick.
And you guys have security deposits, not last month's rent too, which is a nice benefit.
We'll have security deposits. Yep.
Yeah. Too darn sensible in Alberta. I don't understand it.
Okay, so somebody asked, how do novice investors make the jump into commercial and land development? What steps can they take? Are JV the preferred route? I think we did a pretty good job covering a lot of that during our discussion. So I'm going to put a check mark. If we missed anything in particular, don't hesitate to toss an extra question in the Q&A box. Somebody said, I have an opportunity to have a business loan for a 2-door property. It took about 6 weeks to get the confirmation and another 6 weeks to advance the funding. Can you share your experience in terms of time frame? So I think that might have been directed at you, Christian, going back to when you were talking about the business loans.
Yeah, so 2-door properties are typically going to be in the retail mortgage market as opposed to the commercial market, unless it happens to be, have a mixed use type environment. So I've typically found that when you're doing refinances in general, doesn't matter whether they're small or big, you're at the back of the queue and they just take forever. I just had one on a commercial property close in June that I started in November. And part of the issue there, of course, was CMHC, which took about 4 months. But even so, it's just the process is that, especially right now on the retail side, if you're looking at single family homes and duplexes on the retail mortgage side, those guys were just absolutely buried, right? In terms of new mortgage applications, people trying to do refinances, and they're always going to prioritize an impending close over a refinance. But yeah, things have just generally been really slow over the last, they're always kind of slow, but over the last 18 months in particular, it's been really bad.
Yeah. And I think we're going to see, I don't know if you're seeing it, Darcy, but we're certainly seeing some of the markets slow here in Ontario. So I think that it'll be a while before that trickles down into how long financing is taking, but definitely when you start to see the market slow, when there's less competing offers and that kind of thing, then you'll start to see the financing windows shorten as that trickles down to them. But even lawyers right now are just absolutely buried. Like anything in the acquisition world up till the last couple of weeks has been crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. And insurance these days, it's not exactly completely on topic, but one of the areas that's just bananas these days is insurance for residential commercial buildings. Light industrial is a piece of cake. Retail, oddly enough, is still a piece of cake. As single family homes, no big deal, but you get into commercial residential, especially the larger ones, and there are less and less insurers willing to do it. And I can tell you honestly, it's the biggest pain in the butt that I've got whenever I'm trying to do a close, whether it's a refinance or a purchase. You get a risk manager involved. The lenders usually bring a risk manager, right, who comes in and basically evaluates whether or not your insurance policy is going to satisfy the criteria for the lender. And some of the demands are so crazy. You sit there and just wonder what they're thinking, and you end up with policies, insurance policies that are brutally expensive compared to what you would have normally gotten. So I expect, these things all go in cycles, and I expect, over the next 18 to 24 months, we're going to start to see a reversal of that. Policies will start to get a little bit normal, but yeah, that's an area that, from a timeline perspective and a complexity area, the insurance piece of it always just boggles my mind.
Absolutely.
I would agree with that. And I'm going to shout out to Gore in a negative way. I do BRRRR with multifamily in addition to the other stuff that I do. And I've had Gore as my the provider for all of my insurance since 2014. And since then, I added it up. I've paid $300,000 in monthly fees. They just came out with a policy that they're no longer covering any building past that's older than 2000.
Yep.
And that's all my buildings. So I've had to arrange new insurance for every single one of my buildings after $300,000 and 7 years of loyal service. So thank you very much, Gore, for that.
Yeah, I left Gore as well recently.
I didn't leave Gore, they left me, they fired me. So one by one, my buildings came up for renewal and they said, no.
Yep.
Wow.
Screw you, Gore. Anyway.
The importance of having a good insurance broker on your power team, right?
And it's getting harder. Yeah. Like I said, these older buildings, like they're like the really, really old stuff is almost, in Alberta, the old stuff is really almost next to impossible to sell now either. And then also almost impossible to insure. Yeah. And in addition, condo corps are really, really hard to insure now too, if you're part of a condominium corp. So I guess they have a lot of claims. So that's hard to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, well, there's a couple of questions here. I think we were able to cover most of it. A couple of people had questions specifically for Christian or Darcy. So what I'm going to encourage people to do is, these guys are fantastic, super responsive for email. So if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, then please, I'll show you a slide with their contact information. By all means, reach out to these guys, super generous with their time and love helping and giving back to the investor community. Someone had an interesting question at the end. Is there any way for the participants here to exchange email contact info? Perhaps we can see if there's a common interest to do a JV. I believe we have strong positive energy here. Well, first of all, I'm so glad that you feel we have strong positive energy, because I love that. My advice or my recommendation would be, I have a Facebook group called Canadian Real Estate Investing Hub. And it is specifically for people who want to connect with joint venture partners, who have wholesale opportunities or want to buy wholesale property or buy properties from a wholesaler, or people who have private funds to either lend or they're looking to borrow private funds. So if you would like to connect with people who are in my network and potentially attended this evening, then by all means, Canadian Real Estate Investment Hub. And just make sure you check, yes, I agree to behave myself in the group, and then you will be let in. And you can do a post and say, hey, I'm looking at this, or I'm looking for people who are interested in this. And you'll get a whole bunch of people from across the country. I think we're almost at 10,000 people now. So you'll get a landslide of responses, and you should be able to connect with and find a couple of people in the group who would be your ideal people to work with.
So Elizabeth, if I may make a comment on that, one thing that I see that people do and people need to be conscious of is each of our provinces have security commissions, right, which govern how you present deal opportunities and the role specifically of investors or money partners that are non-working partners in particular deals. And so it's important for people to consider the laws within their province and what's allowed and what's not allowed. I just don't want to see someone get into trouble because they've broken, say, the Ontario Security Commission's rules and potentially get a serious fine.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christian. And that is one of the rules of the group as well, is that people assume their responsibility for visiting their provincial regulators and making sure that they are in compliance with the requirements for their province. Thank you, Christian, for pointing that out. Okay. So, as with all of my webinars, we are going to be giving away a book this evening, the Action Takers Real Estate Investing Planner, written by a good investor in Durham, Ontario, Quentin D'Souza. So let's see, Darcy, you are coming from the farthest away this evening. Can you pick a number for me between 1 and 45? And Mary Beth will take a look and see who the entrant number was that corresponded, or what the name of the entrant was that corresponded to that number. And then we will send them a free real estate investing planner. So between 1 and 45.
27.
27, that's awesome. Mary Beth, I know you'll be watching this tomorrow. So entrant number 27 will have gotten the planner. Congratulations. Oh, where do we go? There we go. So here is where you can find us. So if we unfortunately didn't get time to answer your question this evening, if you have additional questions, or you are saying, you know what, these guys, this is exactly what I'm looking for in a coach. So contact information for Christian or for Darcy, more than happy to spend some time and learn more about real estate along with you. And then I have another event coming up on Monday, July 26th. This is my mastermind mini event. So we will be talking to Mark Smith directly about how to secure deals when you are talking to sellers. So this is one of the biggest challenges that a lot of investors have, where they're going, I have this opportunity to work directly with the seller. How do I put this deal together? How do I, educate them on the benefits of working directly with a buyer? How do I make this happen? So Mark Smith, tremendous background in sales, also a wholesaler himself. So we're going to be learning some tips and strategies directly from one of the pros on working directly with sellers. And then my next Monday evening big webinar, the real deal, what Canadians need to know about investing in the US. So we have Glenn Sutherland, who has Canadians Investing in the US podcast. We have Marcin, And then we actually have Lauren, who was a Canadian, is now in the US. She is a lawyer who specializes in helping investors get themselves set up to be able to start investing in the US. And I was super interested to hear, Darcy, when you mentioned that you are looking at doing land development in the US too. I thought that was really cool.
So we're just in the land, we're looking stage. So when I've got some actual results, I'll let you know.
Oh, that would be awesome. We would
I'm
love
excited
to
about
hear
that
it.
too. Also, pretty cool.
So a very special thank you to our speakers for joining us this evening. Absolute pleasure to have you guys here. I learned a ton. I know I'm going to be going back and watching the recording and trying to jot everything down. For those of you who attended, thank you so much for your time, for joining us, for your great questions. And make sure you check out the email that'll be coming out in the next few days. It will have a replay of the webinar. And Darcy has also been kind enough to put together a fantastic little document that's sort of, what did you call it when we came in, Darcy? It was like
Land development primer, we'll call it.
the primer. That's it. It's the land development primer. So if you're thinking either now or in the future you might get into land development, Darcy's done a great job of putting together a primer that will help to get you started, so you're thinking about the right things and planning ahead. Thank you again, gentlemen. Really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you to everyone who attended. So hope you guys enjoyed this. Stay tuned, and hopefully we'll see you again in one of our next webinars.
Sounds good. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Have a great night. Happy summer.